It's hard to believe that Dragon Ball Super Broly is approximately 4 years old as of this recording. To be specific, it's a little bit older than 4 years if you count the Japanese release, and it's slightly under 4 years if you count the American release. But despite all of that, the interesting thing about Dragon Ball Super Broly is that after rewatching it, I can make a claim that it's actually aged extremely well, and I originally saw the movie and thought it was really good. But after looking at it again, I'm on the point of saying that it's actually a great Dragon Ball movie, and probably one of the greatest movies in Dragon Ball history. And that's kind of shocking considering the fact that Dragon Ball Super obviously has a dubious reputation when it comes to the fandom, but if there's one thing that Super did correctly, it was its production of Dragon Ball Super Broly. Now, where do we begin with this video specifically? Well, obviously we have to directly talk about two major things, the animation and the fight scenes. Now, one of the interesting things, and I'm not an anime aficionado by any stretch of imagination, so I'm not going to sit here and point out the intricacies of everybody's different style in depth, but what I can say is one of the things that's awesome about watching this movie is that if you go back and you rewatch it as I did with Mozilla Vulpix, you get a chance to really pinpoint the actual styles, and it feels like a totally different movie in different scenes when you look at Takahashi's animation versus Shida's versus Onishi when Goku originally came in to fight against Broly, and then you get to see Tate later on. And I feel like that's one of the best things about this movie, where it truly feels like a visual marvel. And obviously, I'm not an animation expert, so I can't make a claim that it's as good as something like Miyazaki's Spirited Away, because, I mean, that would be, a pretty massive statement. But I could definitely say for Dragon Ball animation standards, this is definitely one of the best out there. And for a long time, I always believed that one of the best things that was ever animated in Dragon Ball was Path to Power, but when I saw this, obviously my opinion definitely shifted. But apart from just the animation sequences, I think another thing too that really separated Dragon Ball Super Broly from the pack was how they actually handled the fight with Broly, whereas how they handled the fight with Broly in the original movie, where in the original movie, the characters basically just fought Broly, in a traditional sense, and he just basically overpowered them. But the way that Goku and Vegeta were taking turns in fighting Broly in two totally different ways was a very interesting approach. And to be specific, when you look at the way how Vegeta fights against Broly, he basically just wants to fight him, and you could see the excitement that Vegeta gets in fighting against Broly directly, and he doesn't really have any concern for Broly as a character. Whereas when you see the way that Goku fights Broly, he fights in a much more cautious way, as he actually cares about him and he's actually trying to get Broly to calm down. Goku did not want to use direct violence against Broly, and I think that was one of the interesting things about that movie, when you see how Goku and Vegeta fighting the same guy have two totally different approaches. But to move on from just the actual fights, guys, another amazing thing about this movie that I think really added a lot of flair to it was simply the setting. Now, the way that the movie basically takes our characters into having fire and ice was just way more appealing for the movie itself, because you can see as the fight got a lot more intense, you see them fighting in a more fiery background, which definitely correlated to the intensity that was rising in the movie itself. Whereas, when they originally fought, they were fighting in a cold background, which was definitely a good start to start things up. But as you can see, the characters themselves are warming up in the actual fights and progressing. That's when it changes to the fiery background, and I definitely think that having that visual change from starting off cold to heating up was definitely just a very brilliant idea to add towards the movie itself. And, just apart from that, guys, I also feel like this movie did do something successful that a lot of Dragon Ball fans are questionable on, and this is the fact that it ties in a lot of different Dragon Ball backstories that were loosely said throughout Dragon Ball history. Now, obviously, we have the original Bardock the Father TV special that, before anything else came out, that was what we looked to looking at Bardock. But what we see this movie specifically, it managed to tie in the Dragon Ball Minus background, and it also tied in Broly, and it tied in how Goku got sent to Earth, and it basically did all of that, which I feel like was one of the best ways to start the movie off. Instead of just having Broly as just this random alien in the universe that bumps into our characters, the fact that they set the universe up and connected all of these moving pieces was a very successful attempt. Now, if you say it was a good attempt, is this a good retelling of the characters? That's a whole other conversation. And I definitely have some issues with some retellings, obviously, but the fact that they managed to at least try to modernize this Dragon Ball story was definitely a strong attempt, and you could call this hit or miss, but they also canonized Tarble with that statement that they made later on, so at least we know that Tarble theoretically exists in the Dragon Ball universe, regardless of whether or not the Yosun Goku event were to have ever happened. Now, apart from just the backstory, we also have to talk about humor, because humor is an important part of a movie, and obviously, I feel like this movie had a very good mix from the more intense, serious movies that we saw in the first segment, with obviously Frieza coming and, you know, Broly being shipped off and all of these different things happening, but then mixing it up with like the casual Dragon Ball lighthearted humor that we saw at the other points of the movie too, specifically when we look at scenes where, you know, obviously Frieza wants to use the Dragon Balls to improve his height, Bulma wants to use the Dragon Balls for her own, you know, beauty reasons, and then when you also think about the fact that Paragus' original death in the original Broly movie was completely hilarious, but I got to admit that they did a pretty hilarious job of killing Paragus in this too, where basically Frieza's like, hey, let's create a Super Saiyan, I'm just gonna just shoot a beam through your chest, and the fact that Paragus just fell over so casually, it was one of the funniest deaths in Dragon Ball, honestly, just the way that he just died so effortlessly, like Frieza literally just, you know, squeezed an ant. There are so many different things there too, like when you also add in, you know, the negative attempts of Vegeta not wanting to fuse into Gogeta and all of those different things. And all of this just added a lot of light moments to balance off the more serious things that were taking place in the movie itself. Which takes us into our next point about Gogeta. He is obviously the spectacle of this movie, as obviously Gogeta never technically existed in, you know, the Dragon Ball universe outside of obviously Fusion Reborn if you go back to that movie, and the fact that they canonized Gogeta now, and they also showed the fact that Goku can go into multiple different fusions with Vegeta in the form of Gogeta and Vegeta was really something that we just hadn't seen in the main Dragon Ball story before, as we only saw Vegito. And I also like the fact that, you know, we finally got to see, you know, at least for this time, a fully fleshed out fusion battle, because usually when characters fuse, they basically just wipe out the villain either super quickly in a movie, or in the other case, they basically just defuse because they're too overpowered and make the plot too predictable. But in this movie, we actually got to see a fully fleshed out fight, unlike what we saw in Fusion Reborn, where basically once, you know, Gogeta was born, he basically just dusted Janemba and that was a wrap. You know, so that was definitely an also interesting thing to add there too. Now, unfortunately, I have to point out to you guys that this video was re-uploaded due to a YouTube issue on the original upload, but in order to make your time worth it, I've decided to include a talking point that I originally edited out of the first original video to make this video feel fresh in some type of way. And to talk about that point specifically, we are going to discuss one of the best things that Dragon Ball Super Broly did with Broly himself, and that was the fact that they essentially changed his character completely. Now, obviously, Broly is an extremely sympathetic character, and obviously it's pretty hard not to be sympathetic with a guy who's not the smartest in the world, and essentially lives on a planet where he eats bugs as a delicacy with his aging father. And when you factor in that his father eventually got killed by Frieza, Broly basically had nobody except for Shilai and Lemmo. Now, originally it kind of felt like too Disney-esque of an ending to have Broly have some wonderful, helping, loving friends in the end that are now his buddies. But then when you actually think about it, this was significantly better for the show long run if you want to keep Broly along as the main character. Especially because the original Broly was supposed to be a self-contained character, and when you consider the fact that Saiyans are so rare in the Dragon Ball universe, it feels rather wrong to essentially just kill off a Saiyan when he's in fact one of the very few people that is remaining left of his race. So the fact that they were able to retain Broly and essentially make him a character that's a lot more likable, even though the original Broly was somewhat likable, and I always will have a preference to that original Broly that was completely sadistic in that particular form, because I just felt he had a lot more personality. it was at least positive to see that Dragon Ball Super didn't completely follow the script and went into a brand new, completely fresh and original direction with Broly this time around, and I think because of it, it gives them a lot more potential plot usage in the future, especially because Shilai and Lemo themselves can basically act more into uplifting Broly's character than Broly just being by himself, where he's basically just a jock type dude that just wants to fight when he's pissed off. So overall, guys, these are my reasons as to why Dragon Ball Super Broly is a masterpiece.